Hi, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
It sounds like I've got a cold, but I don't think I do. I just started coughing for some reason right before we hit record, so my throat is really scratchy. Antonia, you've kind of had an interesting week. We were getting ready to sit down today and record a podcast. We're actually getting ready to leave for the airport in minutes from now, as soon as we're done recording. We sat down to record a couple different topics of podcasts, but it was really hard to get to any of those topics because of the reason we're leaving for the airport very soon. Your father actually is not doing very well. And so we're getting ready to fly across the country to the Portland area on the West Coast to see your father because he's 81 now and he's not doing very well. And the reason we're talking about this is because we've talked about your relationship with your parents specifically and personally before, Antonia, on the show is about, I'd say 3 years ago on an episode that was, well, actually a two-part called Making Peace with Your Parents Part 1 and Making Peace with Your Parents Part 2. And you unpacked some of the feelings and some of the experiences you've had with your family on that. And I know people were like, let us know what happens. And it's been about 3 years since you really had an engagement with your family. And if you are, a listener that hasn't heard that yet, you might want to go back and listen to those episodes to get some context for what we're talking about today and check in with you. So I guess I'll ask you, Antonia, how are you doing right now? How are things for you?
I'm really, really emotionally zen, which I don't know if that's the result of authentic work or if that's just a numbing out. I can't quite put my finger on it. But I definitely know that my mental real estate is 100% occupied by this subject, which is why we're not recording a podcast on any other subject, even though we attempted to. We were going to do one on some work by John Beebe, and we were going to do one on, some archetypal energies of functions in different positions. And yet my brain is it can't go to that place. It's just 100% occupied by this.
Well, and from a personality standpoint, that tracks because you are in your feeling process, your extroverted feeling, tertiary, 10-year-old process, which kind of shuts your brain off when you're so occupied by it.
Yeah, well, my brain isn't completely shut off. It's just one track. It's highly focused on this one subject. And yeah, it's because it's very relational. It's very relationship oriented. And the emotions around all of this have to do with my entire family, not just my relationship with my parents, honestly. My family is going to be gathered together for the first time since my sister died, and she died in 2003. And there's not really been much closeness, particularly because not everybody has chosen to take the same ideological path. And there are certain members of my family that's just not acceptable to them. And I wouldn't say that my family's ever been close. All right, we've not really been a supportive, close family ever, even when everybody agreed on how reality works. So when we stopped agreeing on how reality works, then the same lack of closeness became a lack of closeness in all ways, not just emotionally, but also ideologically. So we're all going to be gathered for the first time in a very long time. And I'm not 100% sure how it's all going to pan out. I'm trying not to rehearse anything. I'm trying not to predict how things will go down. I'm trying to just stay in a really, really good space. And just like I mentioned when we were talking about this subject last time, self-care was really important when I was dealing with this subject before, when I was around my parents and experienced what I experienced. Then I gave myself permission to do a lot of self-care afterwards. But this time I've given myself permission to do a lot of self-care in a preliminary way.
Yeah.
Lots of rest, lots of making sure that I'm in a really good emotional space. And yeah, I feel bad for the listener because we're talking about Antonia and her parent issues again. But yeah, so it's not I don't think it's a terribly interesting topic to anybody else but myself. And unfortunately, when it comes to any other topic, my brain is bottlenecked. So here we are.
Well, yes, it isn't about type specifically. It's not necessarily about growth specifically, but I think personality type and growth are part of your life, and you use these things as you move through the world in a real way. So I think it can be beneficial to hear somebody's real experience like you, Antonia, as you approach something it's almost like test your mettle. Like you preach a good game or you talk a good game about personal growth and understanding how people are wired and some complex human issues. Well, can you actually operate in a world using these things for yourself? Do they work for you too?
Yeah, Christian Rivera, who's our friend, he's been a guest host multiple times, and he said something I think was very apropos. He said, Ram Dass says, yeah, you think you're enlightened? Go spend a weekend with your parents. And I'm like, yeah, I guess that is probably sort of the ultimate, test of exactly where you're at in your growth journey. So that's what's going to be happening is I'm going to be testing my chops, like let's see just how far I've come. And not just in the context of, or not just in the situation of being around my family, but when you say at the beginning that my dad's not doing well, he's dying. Like, this is it. This is probably one of the last times I'll see him, if not the last time.
He's having mini strokes.
Lots of them. He had a big stroke 3 years ago when I went out the last time. I wasn't sure how long he was going to be around, but he hung around. He's hit basically the life expectancy of the men in my family. He's in his early 80s now, and most of the men in my family die, 81, 82, and he's 81 this year. So, he's I guess very frail. My brother said that he's always been kind of a big guy, tall, sort of strapping, and my brother warned me that he's going to be a much smaller physical presence. He's having a very hard time remembering things. Both his long-term and his short-term memory are shot. When my brother and sister-in-law were talking to him, he's been in a home for a while. And I guess he was released yesterday to go back to my parents' house. But when they visited him in the home, he was asking them questions, and then everything that they were saying he was writing down so that he wouldn't forget and then ask them the same question again. So he's also aware of his own, limitations. So he's very self-aware of what's happening, and he knows that this is an exit and a final goodbye. And when we were checking in, because I'm like, okay, so the last time I just flew out. I just took it upon myself to fly out and visit him. They weren't expecting it, but I didn't want to do that this time because as much as the last podcast where I discussed this probably paints them in not a great light and paints me in this like sort of, I withstood this terrible situation light. The truth is that they weren't expecting me to come out. And so they didn't have any preparation time themselves to know how to figure all this out. And my dad had just had a big stroke, which later on they tried to apologize. It wasn't much of an apology, but they, at least for them, it was a big step. They sent a letter. They basically said, we still don't want to have any relationship with you. We just don't want to talk to you. But, like that, what we did last time probably wasn't terribly appropriate. So, it was like, okay, I get it. I don't think that he was cognitively, there in the same way that he would have been in years past, particularly having had a humongous stroke. And then now he's having a whole bunch of little mini strokes all the time. Yeah. And they said that he probably doesn't have 6 months. He might have a month or two. And if you want to visit him now. So I checked in and I said, is it, I'd like to see Dad. Is that going to be okay? And it was unanimous that considering the circumstances, yes, that would be fine. And that just tells me that our biological wiring is more powerful than any app we write on top of it. Yeah. Like at the end of the day, the bonds of family, which are very deeply hardwired into I would argue, our firmware. As people, family is firmware. And we write a lot of software on top of these things, like our operating systems. We oftentimes call our cognitive function stack our operating system. And underneath the operating system is firmware. That's where our hardware and our software meet. And I would argue that our biological ties are firmware. They're not just software. It's not a socialized thing. It's like part of our DNA. It's part of our bodies. So religion, paradigms, belief systems, all of that stuff, those are all just apps. Those are software that's running on top of our operating system, which is burned on top of our firmware. And at the bottom of all of it is that firmware. And so you can tell that even in a moment like this, or you can tell in a moment like this that as tied as we believe we are to that software, as much as we think that that's the most important thing, the truth is that at the bottom of all of it is this biological wiring that we can't get around. And so fortunately, that's registering for my family and for my parents. And the statement was, in light of the circumstances, I believe that was the specific word said, in light of the circumstances, then yes. So you and I and Piper will fly out. Piper will be able to see her grandfather for the last time. She doesn't really remember much about him, which is kind of sad to me, but it's okay. It is what it is. And so this will be the final adieu. Yeah.
Well, and if you are listening and you're unaware of what we're talking about, we recorded 2 podcasts before this, Making Peace with Your Parents, Part 1 and 2, that you can get the story that Antonia is alluding to of what happened the last time she went to visit her family. Because it has been somewhat of a strained relationship between you all. You don't believe the way they believe anymore, and so there's been some tension and friction. And I think you listening, you might have people in your life that you have friction or tension with as well. You have maybe family members or friends where they have a different worldview, a different viewpoint of how things should be. And that can be challenging, especially if you're close, especially if that, like Antonia talks about, that biological connection, that deep firmware that we have that wires us to want to be in relationship and love our blood relatives, the people in our family, the families we choose, whether maybe it's adoption or a combination of things. These are people that are close to us, that are, our inner selves takes over and wants to connect. And then we have an ideology that might conflict with that. And it's so tough because how do you reconcile those things? How do you have a strong worldview that you really believe in, but also have space for people that you love and are close to that don't share that worldview? And I think a lot of people are struggling with that today. I think that's probably more people are struggling with that than they were 3 years ago when we recorded what happened with you, Antonia, out in Oregon the first time.
Yeah, I recently saw something where a person very proudly proclaimed that they wouldn't make friends with somebody who didn't share their same political beliefs. And every time I hear something like that, it always makes me think, it routes back to this situation that I've been dealing with for basically the last, 10 plus years, more than 10 years. That my family won't have a relationship with me because of religious beliefs. And most of the sentiments that I get back when people hear that is, oh, that's terrible, right? That's terrible. How could they? I'm like, well, I think right now, it's easier for people to understand because they like politics is the new religion, basically. Like we have the same fervor, the same sort of emotional and psychological fervor around politics these days as people have around and have traditionally had around religion.
Even the same markers of symbology, kneeling, all these things that you do in religious circles, they do in these political frameworks.
Yeah, politics has basically become the new paradigms, the new belief structures, the new religions. And so there's this idea that I won't associate with somebody who doesn't share my political ideology is to me the exact same thing as I hear when somebody says that I won't talk to somebody that doesn't share my religious ideology, or I won't have a relationship with somebody who doesn't. And when it comes to family members, it's like, you can trick yourself into believing that, but at the end of the day, the firmware is stronger than the software. It just always is. And at the end of the day, one of the things I'm trying not to future pace, I'm trying not to predict how these conversations are going to go because I don't know. I'm just trying to be present and I'm trying to be zen, right? I'm trying to be really resourced, be there for everybody, not make it about me, make it about the fact that my dad is saying adieu to the world. This is his curtain call, and I want to be there and supportive to him in whatever way he needs me to be, because he referencing back to the systems that we talk about, the typology systems. My dad in the Enneagram is a sexual 8, and he's an ESTP sexual 8, and I'm an ENTP sexual 3. The relationship that we've had throughout our lives has always been really, really special. Like when I was a kid, he used to call me his heart's child, and he was my first fuse bond partner. I think I talked about this in the previous podcast. I'm not sure if I did, but he was always really special to me, and vice versa. And so that that connection, the fact that we haven't been able to have that connection, the fact that I haven't been able to be there for him the last 3 years as he's gotten more and more frail. It's been something that's been very, it's been very difficult to reconcile that I haven't been able to be there for my first fuse bond partner. And so I just want to be present for him at the end in whatever capacity I can be. And so I don't want to try to predict or future pace conversations because I'm not trying to come out on top. I'm not trying to make it so that I don't feel any sense of pain or suffering. Like I'm okay to take these hits this week. I really want to make it about being there for him as much as I possibly can in whatever capacity they'll let me. And so it's when I hear other people try to pretend as if those bonds aren't that important, and that somehow our software is more important than our firmware. I think about the situation that I'm about to enter and go, man, all these wasted years, all this wasted time for no reason.
Disconnection burns time.
Yeah, it burn. You're right. That's the cost of disconnection is time. And so, would I have had a relationship with him even though we don't share ideologies or perspectives about the world or the universe or how things should be? Absolutely, I would have been there for him. And it's sad to me that I haven't been able to be. And the idea that it's no big, that's the cost of having differing opinions. It's like, is it?
or does it have to be?
Or is that the cost of having a lack of emotional maturity? Like this doesn't feel like the cost of clashing ideologies. This feels like the cost of immaturity.
Yeah, because it takes complex coordination between two people who have different ideologies or worldviews to find common ground, to find things they can talk about or agree upon, or agree to disagree. I mean, it doesn't always have to be things you agree on. You can have your difference of opinion, but I think there are some basic fundamental human things. And what's so insidious about this is those are the things that I hear people accusing each other of. You want people to die, or you want people to be whatever, or you don't care about, and it's like a lot of this is thrown around casually. And I'm not saying there aren't people who are hateful and mean and terrible people. Like that is a true statement about the world. I don't run into that many people that are that way in my day-to-day life. Now, maybe I'm going to the wrong places or something. I don't run into all these horrible people all the time. When I run into other humans, they're trying to do their best and they're getting through the world, and from all different ideologies. Like I'm trying to find compassion for people showing up, and I usually look at somebody that's struggling and lashing out, and I go, they're probably hurting. They're probably going through a lot themselves. This is their attempt to try to help something feel better. And it's complex coordination to be able to, an emotional maturity to be able to coordinate with someone that you disagree with. That is really hard to do. It's really hard to do. It's not easy. And that's probably why a lot of people would prefer to probably opt out of that experience.
Yeah, it's a real flex to be able to engage with somebody who thinks very differently about reality than you do. And you can still find the best in the situation, find some sort of common ground, which we all have common ground because we're all humans. So finding the best, steel manning. I've been talking on the podcast about the idea of steel manning, which is finding the strongest part of somebody else's argument. This all takes more from us, and sometimes we don't think we have it. We don't have it in us to do all of that. Okay, well, yeah, sometimes we're very under-resourced. Sometimes we're perpetually under-resourced. And maturity is resourcing yourself, finding the way to do that. Maturity is finding the best in a situation, finding the emotional fortitude to not make your problems other people's problems. And I've been noticing a lot of sentiments from others where I can feel that the energy is true. Of frustration, upsetness, like wanting the world to reflect back to you what you think it should be, reflecting. And a lot of times, you'll see people on different social media platforms, particularly TikTok, where they'll go into these little 10-second rants about how other, I recently saw a rant where the person was very upset that people weren't wearing masks. Now, I don't know at what point this was created. I don't know if it was in the center and in the midst of the pandemic without, pre-vaccine. I don't know exactly when it was made, but the rant was.
You got real specific on the topic. Now.
Yeah,
it's like now it's always focused on the topic.
Oh,
itself.
I'm sorry.
It's okay though. I mean, it's it's illustrative. Don't get triggered if you're listening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah.
Either
exactly.
direction.
However you feel. It was just the person was very upset, and the rant was them talking about how sick they were, and then that they were taking care of a sick partner, like their husband was sick. And that their child was also, had issues, and that they were just so frustrated that somebody else wouldn't, wear a mask around them. Now, I saw it during a time period where vaccinations are available in this country, plentiful, and so I don't know if that they made it now. If they made it now, then the recommendations for how to treat all of this change on a regular basis. So who knows at what moment in the timeline this was made. I just know that when I saw it, the energy of frustration was real. The energy of being at their wit's end was real. But I don't think it had to do with the mask or COVID. I think the rant was primarily or mostly about how much care they're having to do with for their family that is ill. And it felt to me like the real frustration underneath all of it was actually that they're exhausted, like they're overstretched,
underappreciated, overstretched.
Yeah. Nobody is acknowledging how much work they're doing for their family, and so then it turns into kind of this sort of smuggle, this social issue, because they can't get it from their life is not giving them a break, so. I think a lot of what happens is that the energy, the emotions are real.
Yeah.
But the distribution of where they're pointing it might not be like that. That's not. It's a smuggle. It's not like that's not the actual problem. The actual problem is much, much closer to home. And so I think what ends up happening is with these ideologies and this frustration that we project onto the outside world, a lot of it is our own work to do for ourselves. It's the work of making sure that if our lives are really heavy and there's a lot going on, that we ask for the appreciation that we need. We ask for the resource, like we carve out time for ourselves. We do the things that we need to do to make it so that we're in a good space. And then we don't feel as much frustration when the outside world isn't supporting us. Because that's really what it is. It's like I'm already under-resourced, and now the outside world is adding one more layer on top of me. And so then it feels like the straw that broke the camel's back is the problem, that straw is the problem. When really it was like all the straws underneath it were actually the problem. And that it would have been okay had there not been a pile of straws underneath the outside world adding that extra pressure. And a lot of the reason why we get so mad at the outside world is because we're hoping that the outside world won't add anything more to us. When we take care of ourselves, when we address the things that are going on for us, then oftentimes we have enough overage to absorb the pressures from the outside world, and we don't get so mad at strangers or abstractions. It's kind of like projecting our own shadow work on top of the outside world, hoping that they'll do the work for us. If they do the work of changing out here, then all benefit from the outside world doing all this work, which is actually just our shadow work that we need to deal with on our own.
Yeah.
And so I think going back to the situation of dealing with family members who don't share our ideology, if we don't get these kinds of things handled sooner rather than later, then we can either go down the path of you'll. I think in our minds it's like we'll die on this hill. We'll go to our deaths feeling righteously indignant about our positions and our ideologies. Not future pacing that at the very, 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 very end, that firmware is going to show up and go, no, I actually want to be surrounded by my family and friends. I actually want to be surrounded by people who I have a biological attachment to that transcends ideology. And so I think we can either go down like we see in our minds that we'll die on these hills because they're super important to us at this moment in the timeline. But the alternative is that we soften and we don't feel so attached to this position and recognize that we're not going to die on this hill, But every moment that we can't reconcile or make peace is a minute robbed from us. And that's the only thing we really have. I mean, I think we think we're made up of our thoughts and our ideologies, but really actually we're just made up of experiences and time.
Yeah.
And when we rob ourselves of time in favor when we lay time at the feet of ideology, when we sacrifice time at the altar of ideology, there's a moment when time reminds us that it was the only thing we have. So we can either move that timeline up, that moment of recognition up earlier, and then recoup all that potentially lost time.
Yeah.
Or we can say that we're going to die on this hill, not knowing that at the last minutes of actual death, we're going to want all of our family on that hill with us, which is really what's happening with my dad. So I guess all of this is to say that if you are cut, if not you, I'm sure the person listening has not done this. But if it just happens to be that a person has cut family members out or close friends out of their lives because they don't agree politically, I would hope that my parents' situation and mine is a warning of what happens. Because at the end of all of it, if you're treating your ideologies like their religious beliefs, and you're making the same kinds of decisions around politics that people have made around religion, which is cutting people out of their lives because of their belief systems or structures or how they see the world. Let this be a warning that it doesn't matter how tight you are, like how much you think that people will pry it from your cold, dead hands. The closer you get to death, you don't have the energy to hold the grip as hard. Like the energy required to hold on to these ideologies, it's like everything else. Everything softens because there's no energy for anything left except for just the exit. And so like in my parents' situation or my dad's situation, there's just nothing. He's not leaving with anything except for wasted time. Time that he could have been spending with his children, time he could have been spending with his grandchildren, and it, like the come to Jesus moment is actually now.
And this is what these ideologies do to us. They rob us because they have an abstraction of the future. You can always tell an ideology when it's got its like I said, symbols, its behaviors. You can see it inside church. You can even see it in secular movements. It's got its public confessions or apologies or repentances. It's got its future orientation of what we're all living for, which isn't actually now. It's in the future. In the religious circles, it's, heaven or, another world that's going to be created. Maybe secular circles, it's the future, the right side of history. It's always an abstraction toward the future. Mm-hmm. And so this is, but the actions that have to be taken now, like it's all this weird, abstract ideas and ideologies that inform how we live, but the presence of death, like you're talking about, that's coming, brings you down to the moment. It's hard to live in an abstraction of the future anymore. You're here and you're dying, and that's so real and visceral. It doesn't matter what abstractions we have. It's hard to get away from that.
Yeah. What is the future when you have no future? What do you owe to it? What do you owe to these abstractions when abstractions no longer exist for you?
Yeah.
You don't owe them anything. And the only thing is now and what is being experienced in the here and now and the preciousness of that. So, and I think that that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to not abstract into the future for this week either.
We will be right back. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker. Now back to the show. So what are you feeling right now today? What's going on for you as we prepare to go for a week? I'm sure you're feeling a little uncertainty, like you don't know what's going to happen, maybe some anticipation energy.
Definitely lots of uncertainty, lots of unknowns. I'm trying not to make uncertainty an enemy. I think we have a tendency to believe that certainty is our best friend and uncertainty is our enemy. And I'm trying not to make an enemy of uncertainty.
What does that look like?
I think how I'm sort of experiencing it, and I'm sorry if it's hard for me to articulate this and it takes me a little bit, so you'll have to hang with me for just a sec, because there's a lot of emotion in here too, and emotion robs me of my ability to be articulate and clear, as I've communicated many times in the past. I think what I'm trying to do to make a friend of uncertainty is also simultaneously make a friend of the growth work I've done and trust myself. I don't have to be certain about what I'll be experiencing in the future as long as I have a sense of confidence and, self-confidence around the work I've done. Like, I think I'm going to be okay. And I also am trying to make a friend of not being okay. You know, like make a friend of pain. Make a friend of like recognize that none of these things are enemies to be fought. They're friends. They allow me to experience a much more rich life. They teach me lessons. They help me do better at the next situation. Like, okay, am I ever going to experience the death of my father again? No, but I'll be experiencing the death of other people in my life. Like, my mom's going to also die at some point in the future. Her health seems to be okay right now, but who knows how long she'll survive after my father. So I have that death to also process, grieve, and deal with in the future. I will have tough times in a myriad of different contexts coming up. So I will be using this week to accurately gauge how much work I've actually done in the last decade plus. It will be a moment that isn't an abstraction. It'll be a moment of brass tacks. And I am curious to see how I'll do. I'm really curious to like have that time period of calibration to really see how I'll do. And if I fail, if I do poorly at a certain point, if I'm triggered by my family or triggered by a situation and I don't behave well, I regress back to a teenage time period, which actually has happened around my family at certain times. Like all the muscles I built were not in the context of the dynamics of my family. And so when I go back into a family situation, I find old programming coming up because that's the last time my brain remembers engaging with these people. And I've done some work around making sure that I don't regress back to old programming. Like, that was something I specifically worked on. So we'll see if I succeeded and how well I did.
Wow, that's such a good point too, to go back to not cutting people out or breaking connection, because then you're only going to grow and build skill around people that are more like you, and you rob yourself of the ability to do what your parents and you haven't had the ability to do, which is you to grow and continually connect with them over time so you can see how well you're doing with maybe people that you're in disagreement with.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can tell. You can tell that even if somebody's done a lot of growth and development, if they haven't done it around people who disagree with their worldview, as soon as they enter a dynamic with somebody that disagrees with their worldview, it's like they go back to being whatever age they were when they started cutting those people out. That's exactly it, Joel. That's a great point. Thank you for reflecting that back. So, I'm just trying to make I'm trying to make a friend of the entire situation. I'm trying to not see anything as a make wrong. My parents, my family, myself, the situation, all of it I'm experiencing as for me. This is all happening for me. And I get to show up and experience it. I get to do that. That's part of life. I get to have a rich experience in life, which includes tragedy. It includes reconciliation and coming to terms and grieving and dealing with lost time. Like, that's all part of the human experience, and I get to have it. So I'm trying to see it as a friend, and uncertainty is part of all of that. And so I think if I can embrace the situation as opposed to fighting it, and give myself space to have whatever your emotional experience is authentic and honest, and not care too much about other people's opinion of me. I mean, one of the nice things about being in the situation that I'm in is that I've had to do a lot of work around allowing other people to think whatever they want to about me. My mom's entire family thinks very poorly of me. I have a very bad reputation because I left the religion. And so there's a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of misinterpretation of my actions, a lot of projecting ill intent onto me. And I've had to get to a place where I'm good at eating that. I'm just like, okay, well, that's just how people think about me. And so I'm trying to I'm going to rest into it. Kind of doesn't matter what my family thinks about me. It doesn't matter. I care about them and I want to be there for them, and I care about my dad, and that's really the important thing right now. So I'm trying to focus on that as well.
Well, and you're secure enough in your worldview that you're not like having to prove anything. You have enough resource, not just like emotional resource. That's definitely probably the hardest thing for you, is to be emotionally resourced because your emotions get jerked around. But as far as your world, your ideology, you have done a lot of work to feel centered in and okay with what you believe. You don't have to prove anything, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You don't have to show up and like combat their ideology and really set them right. Like you can let them have what they have and just show up as the daughter and the sister and, the relative.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I would say that I don't really feel any need to prove to anybody anything. Like, I'll share my opinions, and I share them in various places. And it's okay if people don't agree with me. I'm totally fine with that.
Was that hard won? Is that hard won for you around your family specifically?
I've never really needed people to agree with me. What was hard won was dealing with them thinking, believing that my perspectives came from bad intent.
So like projection of ill intent is tough.
Yeah, projection that I'm not a good person or I'm against them.
Yeah.
Right, that I'm trying to disrupt, that it's all my fault for disrupting this relationship. Yeah, I mean, that's basically the accusation that I get a lot, which is like, I've known their stance. They were like, they felt this way since before I was born, so I should know better. I think that's really erroneous logic. I think the logic is paper thin and can be torn down very quickly. But it's not my job to try to undermine their worldview. It's not my job to try to point out what I think is not logical reasoning. It's my job to, to live my life, to be responsible for the things that are going on for me. It's not my job to like go in and set anybody straight on anything. And I think there was a lot of, I think to some extent this probably was hard won in general. Because when I left the religion of my youth and I had to reestablish how I thought about basically all of reality. I think I've said this multiple times on the podcast, but it was like the infrastructure of my mind got sucked into a vacuum. And then all of a sudden there was like all of these thoughts there was no peg to hang anything on. There was no organizing principle underneath anything. So I had to basically start from the ground up. I had to redefine reality for me. Without any help. I had lots of help. I had tons of help with other people's models and understandings of the world. I had tons of help in the form of ideas, but I didn't have any help in the form of creating this from the inside. Like that was 100% my job to do. And I think what ended up happening is on the other side of that, I was able to, as brutal as that experience was, I was able to rest into knowing that was all of mine. I wasn't insecure about any of my thoughts or any of my models or any of my worldview after that, because I knew, number one, that I could redo it if I needed to. With more information and better understanding, I could always reprogram my brain again. And two, I wasn't afraid that I hadn't thought things through well enough. I think a lot of the reason why people get knee-jerk responses to people disagreeing with their worldview is that they're afraid that if the attack was too elegant or persuasive, that they would have to really rethink their position, and they're just not ready for that. And so a lot of the offense is actually a defense. A lot of attacking other people's worldview is actually a hope that nobody's actually going to persuasively attack theirs. And I didn't have to worry about any of that. Like I had already gone through all of that, and that was over. So yeah, there's no real insecurity about somebody disagreeing with my perspective or worldview. And to be quite honest, I don't really have this super cohesive, flag planted worldview.
You're a typical example. If you don't stand for anything, or stand for something, you'll fall for anything, right? That's the old saying.
Well, and what's so funny is that I actually think it's the reverse of that. You know, this whole, like, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. I actually think the person who's standing for something has already fallen for something.
Of course.
And that's the crazy thing is it's like, and for me, it's like there are some organizing principles that I believe are important to me. I'm very individualistic. I very much believe that everybody should have a right to be able to say whatever they want to say. You know, like I'm a pretty big proponent of the First Amendment. I'm very hostile to any sort of censorship. I'm very hostile to any sort of attempts to remove individuality. These are things that are important to me. And then after that, there's not a lot, you know, because it's basically what I'm doing is I'm fighting for my right to think whatever I want to think.
Yeah, that's a platform you're thinking about.
Yeah.
Like the platform to say anything on top of. It's not to say a specific thing. It's to say anything you want.
Yeah, and that comes from having been raised in a cult and being told that I wasn't allowed to think my own thoughts. So once I was able to do that, I was like, why would anybody want this taken away? Like, this is the greatest thing ever of all time, is to be able to think whatever you want to think and then say it. So the idea of removing that is, you know, I mean, that was crucial and critical for me, removing myself from cultish thinking. And to me, any form of attempting to remove those rights is going back into asserting cultish thinking. So like that's important to me. But other than that, I mean, there's very few things that I think are super important and that I'll like, you know, there's like one or two hills I'll die on. And it's because the idea of going back into cultish thinking is death to me. So I fight for the right to not be, you know, mentally dead. But then after that, it's like, yeah, well, then you have the freedom to think whatever you want to. And all of that is, you know, is very flexible and very, you know, plastic. So, yeah.
We've been talking about you and the center point of the storm that's about to happen this week and what you're going to experience, because this is about you and your relationship with your family. And I'm just imagining somebody listening along that's in a position like myself or Piper, that's not in your position, Antonia, but maybe you listening right now are partnered with somebody or you're with a loved one that is going through this experience and you're one level removed. And in some ways, this can be challenging in its own way, because for me, I look at you, Antonia, and I get frustrated with how quickly you'll capitulate, right? I'm like, no, they told you not to come over this afternoon. You just we're going to drive over to their house. We're going to knock on the door. We're going in. Like, I'd be much more assertive. And if I was you, I would be this way. And it's like frustrating for me. And I got to be quiet. I've got to lean back. I've got to let you have your experience with your parents. These aren't my parents, but I would approach it very different. And I'm so like, oh, why is she capitulating? Why is she giving them what, like, she needs to be assertive and make sure that they have connection here. This is unacceptable.
So as the person who is supporting the individual walking to the lion's den, how are you thinking about this week coming up?
Well, partly I'm going to be focused on just making sure you don't have to worry about like Piper or anything that's like family, our immediate family. I'll try to ease any like burden on you, as like any emotional burden. Obviously, I'm not going to bring up anything that's traumatic for myself this week or anything. I'll be very supportive on a logistical level, as much as I can be. And then I think I'm waiting. I'm going to kind of be in a preparation responsive mode, because I have no idea what's going to happen. And there's a lot of different dynamics and personalities involved and people that we're going to be around. We're not on our own home turf. We're in other territory, which is not familiar territory for me, even geographically. Like, it's a part of the country I'm not that familiar with. So my orientation is going to be a little off. And I think I'm going to be trying to continue what I've always done since you and I got together in a relationship, which is to show your family love regardless of how they behave. And sometimes that is it's not challenging to show them love, but it's a very odd experience from their side toward me. They react to me like your father told me once. He said, you know, if I were you, I'd be furious at us for how we're treating your wife, and I wouldn't want to talk to us, and you're talking to us. And he was acting very confused by my behavior and how I was showing up. And so it's like a lot of nuanced challenge there. And I think I'm also concerned for Piper. How's she going to experience this as a 9-year-old? She turns 9 tomorrow, actually. Like, so we're going to be there on her birthday. Like, how does she experience all of this stuff? Like, how is she going to interpret this? You know, she hasn't had a relationship with them. Like, she's almost going to be a prop in the scene, because I don't think people are really going to focus on her necessarily, because they're really focused on the dynamic between you and your family. So she's like an accessory that comes with you. I want to make sure she's treated like a person and stuff. So I guess those are the initial things I'm thinking of, but I don't know what to expect. I don't know how to prepare emotionally. I'm just shoring myself up for whatever, really.
And it's a bit of a tightrope too, because you and I have had conversations because of the fact that you see me. This is I'm just going to report what you've told me in the past when we around the subject. You see me as very self-sufficient. There have been situations where I'm like, why didn't you have my back there? Why didn't you defend me? Or why didn't you come to my aid? And you're like, I thought you had a handle. And so I have this sort of like, well, if I was really in a bad situation, would you come defend me? And so now we're going to walk into a lion's den, which very much feels, or an emotional lion's den, or at least it feels that way, like it could be that.
Yeah.
And so now you've got some of that, like, aren't you going to defend me? Like thoughts or words echoing in your head from past circumstances. And then also, how do you defend somebody against their family in a time period of grief and emotional, like things being really emotionally heightened without pouring gasoline on the situation?
Yeah, I was raised to respect, older people, my parents' generation, like what they request for their home or the engagement. I'm like, I want to be respectful. I disagree, but I also want to respect your viewpoints. It is a challenge because I also want to show deference and respect to your parents, but I don't always agree with how they're treating you. And it's like really hard because then am I showing you disrespect if I'm respecting them? Or it's very complex on those levels.
So complex.
And watch what happens. I bet it's going to be like super fun. We're going to come back and be like, wow, that was like way easier. Like we're all prepared for this to be like really traumatic and tough, and watch it be like super easy and everything worked really well.
Well, the last time in the last two podcasts where we talked about this, that first podcast, I was so like optimistic and like everything's going to be great. And the second podcast, I came back and I was like, it was terrible. And so now I'm like, okay, I'm really shoring myself up. And I bet if we end up recording a podcast on the circumstance or scenario, I'll probably be like, yeah, that was totally fun.
Yeah.
So we'll see. We'll see what happens.
So this is, I think, a good place for you listening to just reflect a little bit about your own experience with people in your life, maybe family and friends that have different viewpoints, different worldviews. The idea that we're going to sway or convince everybody to our worldview to have a relationship with them is probably not going to be a reality in most people's lives. And that is, I think, the nature of how life works. We're going to have to figure out how to agree to disagree, how to be in relationship with people that think, and I'll just kind of embody the emotion of it. Like, how could you think something so stupid or so harmful or so dangerous, fill in the blank, and you almost like do a face palm and you just can't believe that this person that you care about, that you love, that may have even raised you from being a child into the adult you are today. This might be a parent of yours or a guardian. How can they be like this? This isn't the person I know. And I think that can be a really challenging experience for most of us, all of us, quite frankly. And so how do you still show that person respect? How do you show them love, even though you may not respect their viewpoint or their worldview, respecting the person but not respecting the viewpoint? Like, these are challenging things. And so we'd love to hear from you because you might have some of these ideas that you've worked with in your life. And what has been some of the strategies you've employed to still have a relationship with people that you disagree with strongly and yet still maintain your own beliefs and your own worldview?
Yeah, I'm so glad you used the word show love. I think one of the challenges that I've had being on the receiving end of somebody who's cut me out because I don't agree with their paradigm is that the argument is frequently an argument of love to not talk to me. Like they're trying to show love in a greater, more abstract way.
Tough love.
Well, not just tough love to me, but I mean like they believe that the actions that they're taking are part of a larger picture of love.
Systemic love.
Yeah, exactly. Like the abstraction of love. But because the interaction with me, I have to really tease out the love they're showing to me in all of this. It's very hard to find the nucleus of love because I know that there is a nucleus of love. I know they're trying to be loving, but it's hard to see, and it requires a lot from me to experience their behavior as love. And I think that when people believe that they're showing an abstraction of love to a larger picture by cutting out those who disagree with them, it's kind of like if you really want to save the world, you have to save yourself first. If you really want to like go clean up the world, you have to clean up your house first. Like it also has to start at a micro level, a much smaller level. And if we're unable and incapable of showing love to the people who are closest to us, then it takes a lot of work and gymnastics to understand how love is being shown in this larger abstract when it's being denied and withheld from the real experience of the people in our lives. Like, are you really going to sacrifice the love you have for the real people in your life that surround you
right now,
in the moment, in the present, for this concept or this abstraction of love for a demographic of people or a larger group of people that you may or may not ever know? You know, like, are we really going to sacrifice
at a future time?
At a future time, exactly. Are we really going to sacrifice the now and the real for the future and the abstract? And sometimes we have to. Sometimes that is required. It is sometimes required to sacrifice the now and in behalf of the future. But love is not one of those things that is a zero-sum game. Love is not something that you have to take from this over here in order to give to that over there. Love is generative. It's one of the most abundant resources, and and the more you have it, the more it creates of itself. And so because love is not something that needs to be apportioned carefully, you don't have to sacrifice the love of the real and now in behalf of the abstract in the future. In fact, you will feel more love in the abstract in the future if you are gardening it now, if you are creating it and generating it now in the real and with the people that you know in the here and now in the present. So I would argue that my parents think that they have to sacrifice love now in order to have a bigger game of love exist. And I would say that that's probably at the center point or the sort of the foundation of the faulty thinking. Mm-hmm. That were they to have shown me love this entire time in the real and in the now and in a way that didn't require so much gymnastics to get there in order for me to like kind of have to understand that at the heart of everything is a foundation of love and what is it being shown and all that stuff. Like if I didn't have to conceptualize the love, if I could just experience and feel it, I would be way more persuaded that their perspective, that their belief structure, their paradigm was founded on love because I would be able to directly experience it myself. I would believe that. But them withholding it from me makes me believe that it's actually all just, this is just, what's the word?
Power play?
Well,
that's how I interpret it.
It's power play, and it's also, I mean, I would argue power play is a big part of it, but I would actually say that even more so, it's their own mental gymnastics in order to continue to think the things that they want to think. This paradigm, this belief structure that they have already thrown so much into, they have to keep feeding this monster in order for it to remain real to them. And the sacrifices that they've made make me believe that they love the belief system, the paradigm, more than they love people. And I think that that's part of what I see when somebody says that they have to cut people out of their lives that believe something different than they do in order to serve a greater good in some way, is the love that I see from those people is actually for the thoughts. They're in love with their belief. They're in love with their paradigm, their religion, their political persuasion. That's the thing that they actually love, not the people that they think that they're showing love to in the abstract and in the future. It's actually it's the love of the belief system that is being fostered, and it's at the sacrifice of the real human beings involved.
That's a certainly generous way of seeing it. I don't see it as love for a belief or an ideology. I see it as a chemical addiction to the hits that people get from those ways of thinking. Those thought patterns produce a bunch of chemical releases in our brain. And this is why people get more extreme in their viewpoints, and they have to and eventually cut people out if it gets too extreme, because these addictions have control over us. And it's so insidious because they're not chemical addictions. It's hard to point to it. They're thought addictions. And I think it's a generous way to see it's love for these ideas over people. I see it as chemical addiction, though. I think the people around you are the ones you have right there. You can reach out and touch them. You can hold them. You can hug them. You can be present with them. These are the people you can love directly. And so it's hard for me to see that as I think it is an attempt of an expression of love, but it's so tied in with addictive behaviors that it's hard for me to give it honor or credence.
I don't think that all love needs to be given a lot of honor. I would agree. I mean, what is love other than chemical
that's
responses?
True as well.
And so, I mean, I think addicts are in love with their drug for sure.
Yeah.
And so you could call it addiction. I think that addiction is a perfectly viable word.
When I look back at my religious connections, it was definitely an addiction cycle. Like it was much of the righteous indignation I could feel, the evangelism I wanted to do, the purity that I was striving for, like all of these things.
The sense of superiority over everybody else who doesn't think like you.
Absolutely. I had the right way of viewing it and everybody else was wrong. And if only I could get them to see the right way. And that was abstracted love in a very similar way. It was like a love in this abstract of convincing people of the systemic nature of their sinful, their sinful ways, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, what a crazy addiction that I had at the time, that I genuinely feel like I can love people more directly now that I've gotten rid of it or I've transcended it. I haven't really opposed it. I really appreciate some of the things I got from the paradigm. I think they've served me in ways, but I know that there's some limitations there, and it was an addictive road I was going down.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you think? You've been listening along. You haven't had a microphone. We'd love to hear from you about maybe your own experience in this. Are you like Antonia? Are you engaging directly with people that you may have a disconnection with, but you love them anyway? Or are you the person that created the disconnection for various reasons, and they're having the issue of being disconnected from you? Or are you maybe 1 or 2 levels removed? Are you like me, where you're supporting someone in this situation? Or you're just observing from a distance and you have a much more bird's eye view of what's going on between other people? We'd love to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this episode. Leave a comment, ask a question, or more importantly, share your personal and unique story. I think it's important for people to hear how all of us show up to the world because we're all wired differently. So we hear different stories, we can start to pattern, other people think differently than me, but it's cool because I see how they're approaching life and the stories they bring. So I think it can really be powerful. So come make your voice heard over at personalityhacker.com.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave a rating review for us on iTunes, that helps us out a lot. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And if you leave us a rating review on Amazon or on Goodreads, that also helps us out a lot. If you would like to go deeper in your personal growth journey, you can head over to personalityhacker.com. We have a catalog of all of our programs and products that are personal growth oriented through the lens of personality type. So if that sounds interesting, head over to personalityhacker.com, look at that product catalog, and see if there's one that's right for you.
My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast. If you're focused on personal growth, I think you'll resonate with our core content over at personalityhacker.com. We want to see you understand how your mind is wired so you can generate motivation, improve social skills, find career opportunities, and master excellent decision making. But a quick warning, we are advice and action focused in all of our articles, podcasts, and videos. This means that we attract people who like to be challenged to become excellent, to take action, to put in the work to optimize themselves, not simply just gather more information. If you are committed to personal growth and ready to radically find your inner truth, then come over and be a part of our growing community of like minds at Personality Hacker.